Well, thank you very much, Brian and Anna and everyone who contributes to this wonderful symposium. And I also want to thank the audience for coming here and the many friends amongst you. And I was counting the years when I first lectured here, well, over there, Piccadilly. It's 18 years ago, so quite...
You don't look any older.
Thank you very much. Anyway, I'm very happy to be back here, and I'm also happy to be celebrating a little bit with you the 300th anniversary of Vienna porcelain, which we are celebrating this year with several exhibitions. There are 2 in Vienna, so please do all come to the Porzellanmuseum im Augarten and to the Markt. And then, of course, also to Florence, as Andrena has pointed out, where Vienna will also play its part. And for this anniversary lecture, as I see it, I was thinking about which would be my favorite period, and the period which is perhaps closest to my heart. As you may know, I like to look behind the scenes, and I like to approach objects in circles and look at the people who commissioned them, and most of all look at the time period in which they were created, and just to understand them from all sides and all depths they transport to us into the 21st century. And of course the period of the Enlightenment seems to be the richest in this respect. So I chose the topic which was also the topic of my dissertation back in when was it? Too long ago. My PhD dissertation on Konrad von Sorgenthal, the enlightened director of the Vienna manufactory in 1998. Yes, here we are, Vienna, circa 1790. And I would like to start with a view of Vienna by Josef Fischer. It's a sepia watercolor kept at the Albertina from the collections of Duke Albert von Sachsen-Teschen, the husband of Maria Theresa's favorite daughter, Mimi, Marie-Christine. And it shows a view of Vienna from Nussdorf, from one of the little villages outside of Vienna. And looking at nature was a new thing in this period, looking at nature while being in a natural environment, and also for the artists, not only the porcelain painters who had their own landscape department in the manufactory under the directorship of Konrad von Sorgenthal, but they studied at the Art Academy under Johann Christian Brandt, who was the first who took his students out into the country outside of Vienna to places like this, Nussdorf, which now is a little wine-producing village still there, but of course the view of Vienna has changed slightly from this perspective. But you can still see in the center, I hope I can manage, the spire of the Cathedral of St. Stephen's in Vienna. It has not changed, and it can still be seen from afar, even though it's towered by other building around it. And it was very important to honor nature in art at this period by really going out into the country, and it was the positive influence of nature was cherished a lot as a source of goodness and happiness, as the theories of that time say. It's the country, even better if you look out to the city. The countryside is free of courtly glamour, as Johann Christian Brandt said, and free of the distractions of the cities. That's what the deep thinkers of that period were looking for. The arts, of course, did not only look at nature, even though it was a very important source, which we will see later on, but they also looked back into history, and most of all, of course, to antiquity, but also to the other great masters of the Renaissance, even of the Baroque, but most of all, and you can see that also from the collections of that period in Vienna, most of all to their contemporaries, which I find quite remarkable. And this wonderful drawing I found in the collections of the Albertina again, and it's by Heinrich Friedrich Füger, who was, I think one can say, the most important figural painter of Vienna of the neoclassical period. And it's a beautiful scene of La Peinture, the painting personified, is indicating to a young student which artists he should take as his models. So he's pointing the direction of his genius, and this is very much in the spirit of enlightened artistic education. Josef von Sonnenfels, for example, was a very important, influential person at the Art Academy in Vienna, and he said that a life in touch with the arts and sciences creates a gentle heart, and it clears the thinking mind and also creates a refinement in social behavior. So maybe we should all think about this more often. So this is the approach to the arts, and of course it also has another side to it, which is still living of very high ideals, but it also has a political background. And we see on the left a painting which you will also see at the exhibition in Florence. It's by Pompeo Battoni of 1769, and it shows Grand Duke Leopold of Tuscany on the left, Peter Leopold, Pietro Leopoldo, and his brother Joseph II in Rome. And the two of them, as you can see, they're holding hands, or they're reaching out to each other's hands as brothers with a strong connection. And on the right, you can see an engraving by Karl Pechwil, which was published in the same year, 1769. And on the lower right, you can see the Imperial and Royal Real Zeitung, which appeared once a week, and it's a very important and interesting aspect of enlightened Vienna. This paper, as you would like to call it, was founded by Jacob Franz Bianchi, and it existed since 1770. It was published in Vienna, and Bianchi was an interesting person. He was an art agent. He was also using a sort of institution, as he called it, a comptoir of sciences, which was also a gallery and a sales room for the arts, and you could also find information on where to find objects. And he also, as I said, worked as an agent. If you were looking for a sculpture by Canova, he was certainly the one to help. And interestingly, it just occurred to me, there was a kitchen bill in Stiftkloster Neuburg, which I found last year for Maria Theresa's birthday, and he also delivered chocolate from Italy. So with your Canova, you could also get chocolate from Turin or Milan, which I think is a nice little aspect on the side. In any case, Bianchi published this Karl Pechwil engraving of this very important and well-known portrait of the two brothers, and he recommended it to his clients to sign up for it. And in this way, people, collectors, and the public were able to know when these, in this era of publications, when something new came up and when they should go and see Bianchi in his comptoir. Very interestingly, there are also other publications which educated collectors in the public. And these were the catalogues of, for example, the imperial collections or other very important collections like the Esterhazy or the Liechtenstein. All the important families and collectors published their works and their collections in those days. And we have here an inventory of the newly installed picture gallery in Vienna, the Imperial Picture Gallery by Christian von Mechel in 1781. It was newly installed at the Belvedere Castle at that time. And in the inventory, which is basically the inventory of the Kunsthistorisches Museum today, we find another version of this portrait. It's made of Roman mosaic and was a present by Pope XIV, Clemens XIV. And it's also in this inventory. And in the inventory also tells us that the Pope gave it in 1779 to Maria Theresa as the imperial mother, as the most pleasant present he could give her, possibly. So this portrait was omnipresent, as you would like to call it. And we can see that Joseph, they're both quite relaxed. They're not in a very imperial pose, so they want to show themselves as almost regular citizens. You just have this rather representative drapery, and you have a look out of the window view of St. Peter, and you have the Roma Triumphans sculpture, which was very important and well known to everyone. And we have a book by Montesquieu, which is also remarkable, and some writing utensils so they can write down their thoughts, a very, very enlightened atmosphere, which seems to be far from the Vienna Hofburg. And this is also another aspect when we look at Grand Duke Leopold, which will also be a topic at our exhibition in Florence. Grand Duke Leopold of Lorraine, Habsburg-Lorraine, he tried to build a sample state in a small country of Tuscany, and there are many publications praising what he did there and how he helped the inhabitants and how he helped science, the arts, and economy also. So the view from the north to the south is probably different as the other way around, but Leopold really was a very remarkable person who tried to make all the ideals of enlightenment come true in Tuscany. And some of these views are also revealed in his porcelain collection, which we will see later on. We saw in the beginning in the drawing of Friedrich Heinrich Füger, where painting instructs a pupil to look out or back or out to the other masters who can teach the genius to become himself and to develop all that the others, the ancestors in art already had achieved. And so copying from old masters or from contemporary masters was not only an exercise for the students, but it was also an art form, a new genre by itself, which was adopted happily by the porcelain manufacturers, of course, not only in Vienna, but Vienna was regarded to be one of the best manufacturers in terms of color and in terms of painting, and also in terms of the education of the painters and modelers, because they were also always encouraged, and they also had to attend life drawing and other classes at the art academy. So painting was developed very precisely and with great enthusiasm at the manufactory. This plate is from around 1800, and on the left-hand side, you can see another page from the inventory of the Imperial Gallery, where the painting is listed. It's at the time it was listed as a correggio. Now it's has been ascribed to Parmigianino with certainty, and it was one of the most favorite motifs, sujets of Vienna porcelain painting at that period. And as you can see, you also saw the Berlin production in that sense. The frame, a plate is of course a very wonderful background for this painting, because you have an inbuilt frame, so to say, with the frame ornament here. So we can see this sujet on cups and saucers and trays and plates, and one of the most favorites of all times, I would say. Peter Leopold is also portrait on Vienna porcelain. This is a cup in Graz in the Joanneum, discovered by Philip Revertera, who I will mention later on again. And it shows Leopold, and I think this is quite beautifully done, with the light, with the aura of the Enlightenment in the background. So it's really the light shining around his head. And this is one of the very few portraits of him as a young man, as a young Grand Duke on Vienna porcelain on a coffee cup. Looking to antiquity,
Christie is falling apart.
Christie is falling apart. Okay. Well, looking back to antiquity, of course, one of the manifestations of the admiration of antique spirit and times are the ruins. And we have, of course, depictions of travelers to Italy, which are drawing amongst the remains of the old times, of the ancients, but also north of the Alps. These sceneries were recreated. And outside of Vienna, just outside of Vienna, there was a wonderful garden on the Galizienberg. It's the Wilhelmsberg today, and it was like an adventure park, we would say nowadays. It was created by the Russian ambassador to Vienna, the Duke Galitzin, and he created all sorts of adventures in one of his most wonderful English-style landscape gardens around Vienna. He also created Roman ruins, which were famous throughout Europe, and it was called one of the most fashionable, heroic Arcadian gardens and experiences. And in 1794, a visitor writes, "The ruins are erected on two hills made with such wonder amongst the landscaped garden, with such art and illusion that it is no other one is so natural and near to nature and near to antiquity than his garden." And it's hardly possible to see them as works of our own time. So they were obviously so close to everyone. Travelers to Italy saw that you could just travel in time and place. And this was the meaning of these garden follies. And here is a wonderful cup and saucer in a private collection, which was recently discovered, and it shows a very refined painting of these admired ruins. And a very early example, it was pre-Sorgenthal even, from about 1780, and it shows with what kind of views people wanted to surround themselves in their interiors, which of course also reflected very strongly this taste for antiquity. And also we heard a lecture about Wedgwood, Wedgwood was, of course, also admired with his jasperware in Vienna, and they started immediately trying to develop a porcelain paste which would be apt for this kind of relief. And so here we have from the Martin collection a wonderful plaque with Joseph II and an original gilt bronze mount. And for those of you who, probably all of you, who have been to Naples, to Capo di Monte, there is a genius made of biscuit of Vienna porcelain holding a plaque like this in his hand. So it's really worshipping Joseph II as an emperor in the spirit of his ancestors from the antiquity. And another example of the Wedgwood influence, and of course England was not only admired because of the gardens and because of the Wedgwood production, but of course all the artistic theory, like Joshua Reynolds' writings were read widely in Vienna, and they were also kept in the library of the porcelain manufactory. And he talks also a lot about the imitation and the copying of the ancient works, so that you learn from that period and you really get into the spirit, and you basically become a better person that is behind all that development. Very interesting, in the Royal Academy, you probably all know this painting, the Tribuna in the Uffizi by Zoffany, by Johann Joseph Zoffany, and it shows the room, the Tribuna, which was some sort of the sanctuarium of the Uffizi collection, of the Medici collection, which was now, of course, guarded by the Habsburg-Lorraine Grand Dukes. And everyone wanted to know what the others had, and I think this is behind all these many galleries, pictures, which at that time also appeared again. Everyone wanted to show and share their collections, but also to see what do I still miss in my collections. And porcelain is a great help in this respect, because you can reproduce objects, sculptures of course, but also paintings on porcelain and with porcelain. And here you can see the marble sculpture of Amor, of Cupid and Psyche, which was one of the most famous sculptures at that time. It was very touching, and it was just something that could be reproduced also for a very pleasant table decoration. So on the left you can see reproduction in biscuit porcelain from the Vienna manufactory, as it was modeled by Anton Gossi, who was also sent to Naples and Florence and Rome to study the art of antiquity, the newly discovered vases and sculptures. And so he came back with all his drawings and his models and plaster casts to Vienna, and he created figures like these. Of course, other manufacturers took this model as well, but in Vienna it became part of a sculptural program, which if you bought in around 1785 or 1790 a large dinner service, you would of course also buy sculptures for the dinner table, for the dessert table, and part of this standard program, as it also accompanied, for example, a great gift of a Vienna, neoclassical Vienna service for Grand Duke Paul in St. Petersburg. These services were accompanied by larger and bigger biscuit figures, and one of them was this one. So it was the standard program, which showed a variety of models after the antiquity. And we have people in Vienna like Count Lamberg from Princeton Stein. He collected also vases. He was ambassador to Naples, and people like him, all the ambassadors to Italy, brought back large numbers of antique models, which, like in his case, he also lent to the manufactory. And he was especially famous for his vases, which he also had published only in 1813 by Alexandre de la Borde in a wonderful 2-volume publication. And he owned about 700 vases. Most of them he brought back from Naples, and it's quite amazing to think how easily, obviously, you could buy these objects. And he was also given then for his services in Naples from the imperial household. He was given about 300 vases from the antiquities collection of the emperor. So this also enriched his collection, of course. And in the end, he sold his collection back to the emperor in the early 19th century. He was hoping to sell it to someone else in England, actually, and also to the King of Bavaria, who was very interested. So he had a lot of applicants for his collection, but eventually it was the Emperor Francis I in Vienna who bought the collection for 125,000 florin at the time. And they're now part of the Antiquities collection in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. And we are very lucky to have a depiction also of his display. It was designed by Karl Schütz and engraved in aquatinta for his publication, and you can see the orderly display of his vases. It's more about sizes and shapes. And this is also very much in the neoclassical spirit, the orderly approach to things which were thought to be part of the heritage of antiquity. And so the Vienna manufactory reproduced some of his vases and some of the vases also, of course, of the Hamilton collection, which you also know from the publication, which was also part of the library in the Vienna manufactory. And as you can see, we have on the one hand a real reproduction, and on the other hand we have a sort of antique fantasy where one would not miss the whiteness of the porcelain. It's in a private collection, and you can see the gilding, which of course you would not have found on an antique vase, original one. Now, Count Princeton Stein, he also collected, like all the other Viennese grand collectors, pieces by Canova. Canova was regarded to be, apart from the antique sculptures, which of course were in each collection, Canova was the follower, and he was the genius of the period. As you know, he also created the memorial for Marie-Christine, for Maria Theresa's favorite daughter. And Canova was in Vienna for a few years in the late 1790s and early 1900s, and all the collectors ordered pieces by him. And this is a drawing from a relief by Canova, and it's dedicated to the Count who we were just talking about. And Canova was also depicted in Vienna porcelain. Anton Gossi, inspired by art lovers and their desire to have a portrait by Canova, as the archival sources say. In 1806, Anton Gossi modeled this portrait by Canova, this bust in 1806, in his private time at home. That's what the archival material says, so it was his own wish to do this. But it was, of course, also then reproduced in the manufactory, the sculpture, and it's quite rare, but we have an example here which is now in the Liechtenstein collections. Another count, Count Fries, who became a Reichsfürst as well. Moritz Fries owned quite a lot of sculptures by Canova. So you can see that the taste was, I wouldn't say everyone had the same things, of course, in their collection, but of course the taste was sort of unified. And we also have to bear in mind that it wasn't only taste, a personal taste, but it was almost like state art, because Austria at that period regarded itself as an enlightened country, and the academy, the United Art Academy at that period, was led by people who were very close, in close contact with the court and the government, and to improve, one of the main goals was to improve society with the arts and also with the education, and it was directed by the goals of the country and of the state. So we also have to bear in mind that it wasn't some art lovers' tastes, but this was what was present, which was published in all these papers, in all these catalogues. It was a sort of unification on many levels. And this is the Palais Pallavicini, which still exists today, as you can see. It's a contemporary photograph. It's a very, very simple simplified architecture, and the most important aspect is that, as you can see here, the Anton Zauner portrait by Joseph II looks directly over to the Count Fries's building, and opposite is the Hofburg itself, the most important, apart from the cathedral, the most important part of the old town, Vienna. And the Counts Fries, they came from a banking background, and they were amongst the richest collectors in Vienna at the time. And Moritz Fries had his children portrait by Carl Joseph Agricola in a watercolor in 1806 as well. And you can see in the background parts of the interior of the palace, and I think it's very interesting to have your children portrait in your own contemporary fitted out home, and to show the connection with antiquity but also with the contemporary period. Lovely portrait of his children, Moritz, Adelheid and Therese. Also in this building, in the Palais Pallavicini, in the Palais Fries at that time, there were many soirees and salons where collectors got together and discussed newly achieved and acquired objects and the state of the arts at the period. And it's by Josef Fischer, and it says here it's après la nature, so he was sitting in that room watching the other artists and collectors discuss the new works. Friedrich Heinrich Füger was also amongst the painters who were widely bought at the for the Fries collection. And this is another sepia watercolor by Füger, showing Antiochus and Stratonica, his mother-in-law, love story, which we can also find on this coffee pot in the Twilight collection, part of a déjeuner in the same style. And this is a portrait by Moritz von Fries in a very theatrical costume, holding on to a plinth of another piece by Canova, which it's probably Bozzetto, but he also owned the large sculpture of Theseus and Minotaur. Here, and very sadly, the family lost all their money during the wars against Napoleon and with all the changes in society and economics. And the frieze collection was sold in the early 19th century. And the sculpture by Canova was supposed to be acquired by the Marquis of Londonderry, but and then it went to the V&A. It's now in the Victorian Albert Museum. And this is how the sculptures were displayed. This is approaching around 1815, just before the collection was sold, and you can see how the public is also visiting these collections. And also the frieze collection was mentioned in all the tour guides of Vienna, and something which had to be seen. They also had pieces by Rubens and Rembrandt and the old masters, but they were very much into contemporary art. And the Vienna manufactory, as I said before, reproduced a lot of contemporary sculptures, but also invented in the ancient spirit, all these bacchanals for the dessert table. And these are new acquisitions by the Martin collection, which are quite wonderful. And I also like the way they're photographed. It's very dramatic. And it also gives you a little sense of how they might have looked in candlelight on a sumptuous table. They were accompanied, of course, still laid out in great symmetry by small vases like this one. And this vase, this biscuit vase from the Esterhazy Collection, shows you already the approach to simplicity, which was very much a signe of that period. For a book which the Augard manufactory published, which I wrote. I'm just showing it because this picture comes from the book, and it was photographed by Sebastian Menschon, who's here as well. He also did the design for the book, and we had a wonderful time traveling with pieces of porcelain to special places. And I'm only showing you this neoclassical example. We traveled with Sorgenthal cups. You all know the amazing variety of ornament and of colors at that period. And we traveled to Schloss Losdorf, which used to be a Liechtenstein Schloss. It's now owned by the Piatti family, and it's still open to the public. You can visit these wonderful rooms with the painted wall decorations, which are, of course, very much inspired by publications like Le Antiquità, the Ercolano Esposte, for example, or the Lodge by Raphael. And you can see all these ornaments and border decorations, and also the figural parts, and wonderful color scheme as well, which makes a great backdrop for these cups. So we traveled with the pieces of porcelain to various palaces and interiors of different periods, and it was wonderful to see these objects come alive in an interior for which they were made, and the spirit of the period was present, which was quite an amazing experience. So this was found amongst, the heritage of the manufactory, which was given to the MAC, to the Museum of Applied Arts. And I don't know exactly what it was for, but it shows you an ornament in wax, a wax model for a relief ornament, probably for a biscuit table decoration. And you can also see the spirit of the time in the silver. You can see the scroll work, which comes from antiquity, but also a new taste in silver and wall decoration. Both these pieces come from the Liechtenstein collection, and on the right-hand side you can see a piece by Ignaz Josef Wirth, who was actually from the dynasty of the Wirth, the most important silver and goldsmith of Vienna at that time, who worked for all the collectors I have mentioned and many more. And this is the sad remains of one of the most magnificent palaces in Vienna at the time. And if you think of Vienna, you probably think of all these Baroque palaces and the Baroque building boom in the early 18th century, which we spoke about in Fired by Passion very much. But now we have another boom in the period around 1790. We still have, of course, most of the Baroque palaces were kept, but the interiors were changed by people like Hartmut, by Heinrizi, by all these wonderful architects who changed the Baroque interiors into the new contemporary neoclassical style, which was very much promoted by all the families who were influencers, as we would say nowadays, because you can't only have porcelain or paintings without having your whole life changed in this style. That's a new acquisition, also from the Martin collection, which I really like very much, and it's very, very rare to have this silver ground with the blue. And here we come to another not so well-known palace, which is in the country, in Niederösterreich. It's the Castle of Ernstbrunn, Palace of Ernstbrunn, which was fitted out by Benedikt Heinrizi. And this picture is taken out of a 2-volume book which Hans Kreffner published on neoclassical and Biedermeier art in Central Europe. So he looks outside the borders of Austria, and it's very, very, very interesting. He discovered long lost and forgotten interiors which are quite impressive. And the most impressive interior in Ernstbrunn, in Niederösterreich, in Lower Austria, is the stone room, the so-called stone room, which is very sober architecturally, which really takes us into a new spirit, into a new era. And here there was a large collection of minerals and also of petrified wood, like this one, and this shows how these pieces were displayed. And this is one of the aspects which you will also see in Florence, of course also in connection with the pietra dura background which the Habsburg-Lorraine brought back to Vienna. We also have this great interest in minerals in all the collections I mentioned. You don't have only the fine arts, you have decorative arts, and you have natural historical collections. And this is a box which is in the V&A, made in Vienna around 1790. And on the reverse side you have the numbers of the stones, and of course an introduction to the stones, names and the backgrounds of these pieces. And the porcelain painters studied the mineral collections, and you can see an agate study, a watercolor from the former imperial manufactory, and a wonderful agate cup from the Revertera collection. And this is a soup plate from an imperial service which shows Swiss glaciers, mountains, the Swiss Alps, and the Zurlauben model for it. And the interest in the Alps, and this is also something, subjects which will be featured in the exhibition in Florence. And I'm very happy to say that Philippe Revertera will contribute with some of his insights about Archduke Johann, who really researched the Alps and went on long expeditions with his artists and scientists. And he was a son of Peter Leopold and came from this highly enlightened background. Of course, we have the English gardens. This is Luxembourg, drawing from the manufactory's landscape painter Sartori, and a cup and saucer depicting the same imperial English park with all the follies and gardens. And we have a new and an old taste for the chinoiserie. Chinoiserie seems to be an eternal topic, and this is a model for the Luxembourg, for the imperial park, of a very restrained chinoiserie pavilion. And of course, the manufactory also produced lacquer imitations. And this is a plate from 1805 from the Augarten Museum. And it's, of course, very close to the Sèvres production. And it's a very rare, it's actually the only piece I know of this design with the silver and gold. And it's absolutely the finest. And I had visitors from Rome and from Florence the other day in the museum, and they said it's better than the model. So that's what you would want to hear. And again, going back to Füger, I just also want to show a person, an unknown person of that period. And I also like to always look into the faces of the people of a certain period. And I think Friedrich Heinrich Füger, who was most famous also as a miniature painter, shows an enlightened man, an enlightened person who really looks out into the world with an upright position and a very self-confident and look of research and wanting to know and discover the world. And I think people like him, he would use a déjeuner with the first iron bridge in England. And this is a déjeuner which comes from Ferdinand III. It's kept in the porcelain collection in the Palazzo Pitti. And I think it's quite remarkable to surround yourself with a chocolate service which shows the first iron bridge. It would be like, I don't know, if we would reproduce one of the amazing towers of Dubai on one of our coffee services. So it's a very contemporary period. And in silver, speaking of chocolate, this is the famous chocolate pot by Joseph II, and shows you, apart from this very daring little detail, it shows you a sober approach to shape. And this is not by Joseph Hoffmann, but it's from 1815 by a Viennese silversmith, as well as this wonderful shape. So Vienna was very contemporary, very modern in their shapes, and this quite amazing pair of plates. It can hardly become more simple than that. You have agricultural tools as an ornament for your dinner service. And these are some grass studies which are kept from the porcelain manufactory archive. So you can see one looks at the most simple parts of botany and they become an ornament. And this is also one of our travels in time. And I would like to end the lecture with this picture. It's to Glacier from a large service with grass ornament, just simple grass on the beautiful, restrained, shaped in the antique taste, in a newly discovered interior at Schloss Felsberg, Waltice, which is a Liechtenstein Schloss. And these are some back rooms facing the garden, which are not open to the public. They're now under restoration, and you will soon be able to visit them. And they're the finest in wall decoration you can get around 1800. And it's also with a fine gilded relief, and it reminds very much of porcelain decoration in this probably dining room at this period. And I would like to end with, you all know, the Wiener Diarium, which was one of our big subjects in Fired by Passion and a great source. The Wiener Diarium and the Wiener Zeitung is the follower, or it became, this journal and paper became the Wiener Zeitung, and it's still alive since the early 18th century. And on Sundays, you know, in Vienna, shops are still closed, and if you want to have your morning paper, you go out into the streets and you have these plastic bags where you can get your newspapers. And I like that the Wiener Zeitung kept to its spirit, and it still says the world is only understood in the connection with, you know, knowledge. It's good to know. That's their slogan. So connection, knowledge brings an understanding of the world, and I think the arts can help us greatly in that. Thank you very much.